Right, so the Hayne Royal Commission. What Calvert was going to talk to you about is what's been a salutary lesson in corporate governance failure in the UK, in Australia. Why is it I mentioned the UK and why did I mention Ireland? Maybe in context with this is that both countries are very much looking at this fallout from this inquiry. Royal Commissions in 1902, Australia decided in its wisdom to adopt the year after Federation the Royal Commissions Act, straight from the UK, and it was a massive inquiry and it was led by a guy called Hayne. Hayne would sit there very saliently and sort of start looking by evidence base. And it's been a demolition of banks mainly and also other providers. But where did it start? Senate committee recommended a Royal Commission about the Commonwealth Bank following multi-million-dollar failures in 2014. 2017, more wrongdoing was uncovered in the Commonwealth Bank. You guessed it, other banks were named. Add to that, the federal opposition was pushing for a Royal Commission over an 18-month cycle. And even more and more pressure started building up to the point where the then government sort of relinquished because they lost control of the numbers. In politics, as we know, ladies and gentlemen, you've got to count, and they couldn't count. They couldn't rely on certain backbenchers who were pushing for an inquiry. So off we went. The Hayne Royal Commission started, and Hayne, a former federal court judge, a wily character, said, right, I'm going to hire the best counsels assisting, and Michael, gentleman from formerly from both experienced barristers from Melbourne, came in and they basically asked and wrote to all the providers saying, can you provide us with evidence on some of these issues? And that evidence was taken in, they analysed it, and then they've got the CEOs in the stands and they started pounding them with questions like, is greed good? Was there a culture of greed in your organisation? And more importantly, Calvert asked the question, could it infiltrate into New Zealand? He's asking this question. Could some of this cultural bias, if you like, have come into New Zealand? So is there a conflict of interest between trustees and representatives? And we saw that. Fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, advice was being charged for, but advice was not being given. Wow. So you're telling me that they're getting charged for advice, David, but they couldn't get advice because the advisors didn't exist in some cases? Yes, ma'am. That in some cases would be called misappropriation. It could even be fraud. Well, it's going to be tested in the criminal courts. But the key performance indicators of the Royal Commission started growing and it started getting CEOs. And I've never seen it. I was down in Sydney in 2018 and people were watching the Royal Commission on their handheld devices at lunchtime. Everybody likes to beat a bank, but this is bank beating and I declare an interest. I work for a bank formerly. So what has happened in the Australian culture was the remuneration typologies, this view of remuneration, is it right? Does the punishment fit the crime? One thing you never do is sell risk policies, insurance policies to Down syndrome people. That's just probably not a good idea. It's called a vulnerable consumer, ladies and gentlemen. It's probably not expert to do. But an insurance company did do it. They sold it to a 29-year-old Down syndrome man who was trying to please these people on the telephone. Because he was a young man who cared for his parents, and the story was, buy some accidental death cover, buy some death cover, and buy some house insurance, and it will protect your mum and dad. Well, the problem here for the insurance company was the mum and dad was a pastor, and his wife was also a pastor. So politically, the image is going to look awful. So when they went back to the insurer challenged and said, no way. And then eventually these tapes of this young man being sort of cajoled to buy this policy were played to the Royal Commission. The CEO who was in the thing said, we're sorry, what do we do? Well, the Royal Commissioner said, you did do something. You did do something, you did nothing. So that's quite serious. And I'll leave you with this salutary lesson that the regulator, ASIC and APRA, and we've got regulators in the room, they're going to get after these guys with the biggest stick because the regulators were criticised. They were seen to be weak, incompetent, blah, blah, blah. And as a former regulator, we don't like that. The union of regulators, when we criticise, mould together, get together, and then come out fighting. You'll watch this in Australia, the behaviour will change. Consequently, the political, economic and social issues are now being manifested into criminal charges. If you're an insurer and you think you've been selling policies without advice, what do? You commission an independent report by a leading law firm in Sydney to give you an independent report. I've got nothing wrong with that. What I have got a problem with, and what Calvert and I stand by and say is wrong, is when you get to that independent report and the chairman starts correcting it. He starts crossing it out. Starts saying, remove any reference to our CEO. Or start telling lies. Did you correct the report, says the regulator? No, we did not. So on the stand, that particular insurance company shall remain nameless, but I am the AMP Churchill Fellow in 1995, said quite clearly we breached the Act, the Corporations Act, 18 times, or maybe 19 times. There was a bit of a squabble. The net effect of those, if you breach the Corporations Act, is that criminal charges may develop. And Nick will sort of explore some of these concepts as well. So for New Zealand, the corporate governance in the future, where to from here? Well, there was the trustees and there was an obligation. It's worth having a look at the testimony by the National Australia Bank trustees. The lady was asked, have you breached the Act? Hayne asked, have you breached the Act in a civil manner? Yes, maybe. Have you considered breaching the Act in a criminal manner? She said, no, I don't think we did. And Hayne said, well, I think you should. So people are now loaded, we would say in the regulatory parlance, locked and loaded. And so does this mean the trustees and duties in New Zealand will need to be tightened up? Does trustees in Australia, did they just fail? Was it just like a mind-blowing experience where they just went to Randwick races and just put it all on the fourth horse? No. I think what as I saw as a regulator was and Raj Rumani from the World Bank, economist in 2006, talked about this, where he linked commissions or how much a person gets paid with behaviours. He argued in 2006, and he's argued against by Larry Summers and of course other central bankers, was he said that the reason why we're into dangerous territory with the financial crisis coming down the track is that people are increasingly remunerated to take on risk and take on debt. I've just broken that, Susan, don't worry. So that's the most important consideration. In Australia, we saw that risk and commission were getting basically mixed up. Trustees, is it profits for all cost or something else? And perhaps the answer is in what happens in Australia. And I'm sure the regulators are going to be looking at this in the future here in New Zealand. So what's in store for New Zealand? Well, Calvert identified the governance issue on what is the future of governance. And more importantly, what is happening with the carousel in KiwiSaver, where there's a predominance of Australian banks on the carousel. I don't want to come across as emotional or excited, ladies and gentlemen, but this is serious stuff. Really, this is bad stuff. This is awful stuff, and I feel embarrassed. I've testified in front of you, the United States Congress, several times, 4 times, and I said the Australian system is squeaky clean. Well, it's not. But is there going to be a fallout for New Zealand? Is there a clash between industry cultures, not-for-profit cultures, and where is the future going forward? You know, I often hear Sam Stubbs from Simplicity, KiwiSaver, I think Simplicity, talk about this country should go like Singapore, become a Pacific tiger using KiwiSaver. Well, good luck with that. But if you're going to do that, you're going to have very, very much enhanced governance standards. And we thought we had it in Australia. So that's where I'm going to leave it off, and I'm going to invite Nick to come down, stage left, and take on a bit of the Australian position. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.